This episode of the Best Armies in Warhammer 40k is sponsored by Frontline Gaming and the Las Vegas Open, now taking place from October 2nd through 5th, 2025. More about them later on. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and it's time for another episode of the Best Armies in Warhammer 40k. This is the weekly video series where we go through undefeated results from the last week of competitive play in Warhammer 40,000 and talk about what is currently winning. Now, this is a bit of an interesting week, since about halfway through the week, we got a hugely transformative points update that dropped hammer blow nerfs to a lot of the game's top factions, including Death Guard, Chaos Knights, and Imperial Knights, factions that were dominating the meta in weeks past. However, because of the rules cutoff for most events that occurred this weekend, many events did not use that update, meaning that their results are a little bit outdated. What I did this week is go through specifically events that used the new update. So we are going to be looking at events using largely the most updated variety of the rules. Now, with that in mind, let's hop into a metagame breakdown and talk about what is doing well at these events. First off, we have Thousand Sons, who look like the best faction coming out of the gate from this update. The Thousand Sons were already doing fairly well, although they had inconsistent matchups into things like Knights and Death Guard. However, with those factions being nerfed, Thousand Sons are poised to do incredibly well. Although there is a scuttlebutt that is that we will see some changes to this faction in a couple weeks once we hit an official balanced data slate. Thousand Sons took down 2 events, going undefeated at the Geek Fest Summer Heat, an event large enough to have multiple undefeated at the end, as well as winning the That 6++ GT. Now, Space Marines also did fairly well this weekend, with new supplements taking down 2 separate events. Black Templars winning the Geek Fest Summer Heat, and Space Wolves winning the Warzone Tucker Brewing GT. Space Wolves using their brand new supplement and even a Saga detachment, not any of the standard Gladius Task Force builds that we've been seeing becoming popularized with the Space Wolves faction. Now, Adepta Sororitas also went undefeated at the Second City Games. Leagues of Votann took down the WTGC Southeast Siege 1, the Mandrake Menace. A bit of a long name for that one. I will mention, however, I don't think we're going to be breaking down this list in detail this week because that event used the index rules for Leagues of Votann. It did not use the codex rules, which came out alongside this update. And that's the case for a lot of events that are actually holding off on the new Leagues of Votann rules because, again, they are brand new. The Munitorum points for them literally just dropped a couple days ago. Nova Open, even a Super Major coming up next weekend, has announced that it is using the points values for Death Guard and for the Knight factions. However, they are not updating Leagues of Votann, meaning that Votann players will not have to rebuild their lists. But I do want to give a shout out to Dan Ahern for going undefeated with an Oathband detachment from Leagues of Votann in that event. Now, moving on from there, the Tronderholm 3 GT had an interesting result with 2 undefeated factions, 4-0-1, both of them with a draw on their record going into the final round. Now, interestingly, this was not a draw in the finals. Both of these players had drawn earlier in the event, meaning that they were both in line for an undefeated slot. And that wasn't even a differential scoring draw. That was a natural draw, 88-88 in the semifinals. That was Tau Empire as well as Drukhari going first and second, respectively. Now, we also saw an undefeated Aeldari X-0-1 at the Hyper 364 GT. Now, I believe that was a bit of a handshake ending. From what it looks like to me, the two players who were undefeated who ended up being paired in the finals, there was no mathematical way that the Eldar player could lose, or at least it was very unlikely mathematically that they could lose because they were going in at 4-0 and their opponent had 2 draws on their record as well already using differential scoring. So even if the Aeldari lost that round, they would both be at an equal number of tournament points, and it would come down to tiebreakers. And if the Aeldari tiebreakers were higher, then there was no way that they could lose the event. So they ended up just, it seems like to me calling it around early. I don't 100% know if that's what happened, but ended up taking down the event with an aspect host as well. Now, as a little bit of a treat, I do want to break some of my rules here. Normally, I don't cover events that use the outdated rule sets, and I don't cover smaller events, but I'm going to break those to talk about the Eternal Wrath 2025 GT. That was only 17 players, but it was won by Grey Knights. It was using the old points values, but I do want to talk about Grey Knights in their new codex, so I am going to be including this list on my breakdown this time around, so we can talk about some undefeated Grey Knights results. And with that, that's the metagame breakdown for this week. The reduced volume of events has given me some extra time, so I am going to be breaking down these lists into a slide format rather than doing the normal screen record that I usually do on this series, and we'll jump into that after a word from our sponsor. If you've been in the Warhammer 40k community for a while, you've almost certainly heard of the Las Vegas Open. This event includes the world's largest Warhammer 40,000 tournament every year, the LVO Championship, which includes somewhere around 1,000 players every year. But LVO is not just a Warhammer 40k tournament. In fact, it's one of the scene's largest tabletop gaming conventions of the year, including open play, events, and vendors for a wide variety of different miniature games. And if you're not into tournament play, there are also casual and narrative events at the Las Vegas Open. Frontline Gaming, the organization behind Las Vegas Open, has asked me to tell you today about the LVO's new date. They've actually moved to an October timeframe, and this year's show is going to be taking place from October 2nd through 5th, 2025. Ticket sales are currently open for the event, so check out the links in the video description to get access to those today. Big thanks to Frontline Gaming and the Las Vegas Open for sponsoring this video, and I hope to see you there. Now, with that, let's hop into our lists and talk about our first one from GeekFest Summer Heat, Darren Thomas. And while Darren did go 5-0, he didn't quite win the event. However, his build was relatively interesting. Now, Darren was playing a Grand Coven, the standard detachment for 1,000 Suns. It gives you access to a variety of sort of combat doctrine style of effects, including things like devastating wounds, +1 to wound, or additional range on your psychic weapons. Benefiting from that is a Demon Prince of Tzeentch with wings using the Eldritch Vortex of Atef. Now, the Demon Prince with wings gets huge benefits when it deep strikes onto the battlefield, including a massive sustained hits for its offensive power. That Dark Blessing is shooting 9 Strength 4 AP 1 damage shots with Ignore Cover and Sustained Hits 1. However, that ability increases to Sustained Hits D3 if it uses its Aether Stride when it arrives. And with Eldritch Vortex of Ataf, it's getting +1 strength and damage. So it goes up to Strength 5, 2 damage. That makes this guy a little, like basically a little small Lord of Change, I guess. Or a kind of a discount Magnus the Red. And if you pay 2 CP to give him full rerolls, that Sustained Hits can actually pop off in a big way, which makes the Demon Prince incredibly good as a disruption piece. Now, we also have an Infernal Master, Magnus the Red, a Sorcerer with Umbellific Crystal to teleport his unit around, as well as a Standard Sorcerer and a Terminator Sorcerer. Another 3 units of 5 Rubric Marines in the battle line here to attach the Infernal Master and the 2 Sorcerers, as well as a ton of utility. 2 units of 6 Zangor Enlightened. We don't have any attachments for those guys. They're going to be running around by themselves, as well as 3 units of 10 Zangors for their up-down scouts, forward operation, and score a bunch of points. Now, that's going to be necessary because what is not scoring points, and instead is doing a bunch of murder, is a unit of 10 Scarab Occult Terminators to jump in with that Terminator Sorcerer. Now, the Scarab Occult Terminators make excellent use of the 1,000 Suns army abilities. They're obviously a huge brick of very resilient Terminator profiles. They come in a standard Terminator profile, but they have a -1 to be wounded effect if they contain 1 or more Psyker models. The interesting thing about this is that it includes both any attached characters as well as the unit champion who has the Psyker keyword, the Scarab Occult Sorcerer. Now, the Sorcerer has 4 wounds, as well as that Terminator profile. And because he's a Psyker, he can use stratagems like Destined by Fate to keep himself alive, meaning that you have a potential 4-wound little guy who can take a bunch of punishment and go down without losing the unit's -1 to be wounded effect. So they're very tanky, and once you start applying rerolls and additional bonus AP to their weapons, the unit is packing a pair of Hellfire Missile Racks, as well as a pair of Soul Reaper cannons, in addition to the psychic attacks from the Sorcerers and a bunch of just standard Infernal Combi Bolters. These guys can pop off for some crazy damage, which gives this 1,000 Suns army a lot more resilience than you would typically see. And it's a unit that you really want to be focusing your buffs on because it's a huge battery of firepower. That gives the army another really powerful brick of both damage and resilience that they can focus their stratagems on, in addition to Magnus the Red, which allows you to lose 1 or 2 of those pieces between Magnus the Red, the Tzeentch Demon Prince, as well as this Scarab Occult Terminator brick, forcing your opponent to overextend to kill them. You can counterattack with Rubric Marines to kill the stuff that kills this stuff, but then that allows you to basically just siphon all of your command points into one of the other really powerful shooting batteries that you have in the army. That's a really interesting way to play 1,000 Suns, and definitely not the same as the more distributed game plans that we see out of armies that are focusing on units like Mutalith Vortex Beasts. I also think that there's a likelihood that things like Mutalith Vortex Beasts get points increases in the next balanced data slate, and an army like this will likely dodge that because it is focusing fairly heavily on this non-standard unit of Terminators. Now, we're going to stay with GeekFest Summer Heat for a moment and talk about some Black Templars coming from Keenan Elliott. Now, I talked at length last week on a live stream about out a variety of different army builds to be played alongside Black Templars, as well as some Black Templars builds that were doing well in tournaments. So if you want to hear me wax philosophical about this faction and its build in Gladius Task Force, I do that in those videos, but I will run through this one nonetheless. Now, this is an interesting one because it is focusing very heavily on heavy vehicles. It is taking Gladius Task Force. Unfortunately, there is not a lot of play in the Black Templars detachments themselves. I think the general consensus of the faction is that its units and datasheets are phenomenal, A+, no notes. However, its detachments are largely unplayable, which means that if you use the more standard, very beneficial detachments inside the standard Space Marine Codex, the faction's actually going to do really well. And given the fact that Space Marines do have maybe one of the best selections of detachments in 40k right now, especially with Gladius Task Force in the mix, that means that Black Templars are set up fairly well to do well in the coming season. Now, this list in particular is running a trio of Castellans as well as a duo of Marshals. Now, the combination of the Castellans and Marshals means that the Marshal gives you 5+ critical hits. Basically, every single weapon on any sword-carrying Black Templar has lethal hits, so that's going to give you a 5+ critical hit effect. The Castellans can take a leadership check to unlock full hit rerolls in melee to then get you additional lethal hits. Not to mention the fact that the Marshal and the Castellan together attack 1,000,000 times with lethal hit melee weapons, and they can attach into a Sword Brethren squad for an additional 15 lethal hit 2 damage power sword attacks. So there are 2 of those combinations, 5 Sword Brethren, 1 Castellan, and 1 Marshal, alongside a High Marshal Helbrecht, who can dual attach with another Castellan as well. Now, Helbrecht is going to do mortal wounds as well as increase the strength and attacks of the unit, which, while they don't get the 5+ critical hits, is going to improve both his and the Castellan's melee attacks, as well as those of the Sword Brethrens. Plus, based on the size of his unit, he also deals mortal wounds at the start of the fight phase, so his damage output compared to that of the Marshal is going to be pretty similar, although he himself is a much more competent combatant. Now, we're also taking an Emperor's Champion with the Honor Vehement. He can attach into an Assault Intercessor squad that's in the battle line there, and especially if he can charge into a character, he can use his once per game Devastating Wounds to use the wound rerolls off the Assault Intercessor squad to do some absolutely incredible damage. The Emperor's Champion gets insane force multiplication from that Assault Intercessor squad, not to mention the fact that his sword goes up to potentially strength 10 in Assault Doctrine thanks to the Honor Vehement, so he might not even need those Devastating Wounds to convert his hits through. We also then have a combi weapon lieutenant in order to do some utility, as well as an infiltrator and scout squad, and a ton of vehicles, a Land Raider Redeemer, as well as 2 Repulsor Executioners, with heavy laser destroyers for some anti-tank shooting. The Black Templars Repulsor Executioners, in addition to getting their pinto-mounted multi-meltas, get hit rerolls when targeting enemies that have a nearby Black Templars unit, so that could be something like the scout squad can run up to an enemy unit. The army does not benefit from Most of Moment, since it replaces that ability with Templar Vows. However, it doesn't need that, because that whatever your spotting unit for the repulsors is going to get them full rerolls anyway, and theoretically your Sword Brethren squads have full rerolls from the Castellans attached with them regardless. The Land Raider Redeemer gives you a huge boat who can carry around the combination of the Emperor's Champion, Assault Intercessors, and one of the 2 Sword Brethren bricks, whereas each of the Repulsor Executioners is also capable of holding one of those Sword Brethren squads, and potentially using their reactive movement to re-embark into those transports after they commit in and fight. This army is incredibly well-rounded. It has a lot of ranged units between the vehicles that can benefit from the Gladius Task Force ranged effects, but it also has a bunch of melee units that will benefit immensely from things like Honor the Chapter and Assault Doctrine. Now, moving over to the Warzone Tucker Brewing. This is a 60-player GT. Well, had a couple players with draws on their record, natural draws. It used a standard scoring metric. We saw Z Martin actually take down the event with Space Wolves, and not any Space Wolves, but Space Wolves using their bespoke detachment, Saga of the Beastslayer. For those who don't know, the Saga detachments from the Space Wolves supplement grant an additional bonus if you're able to achieve some specific criteria. For Saga of the Beastslayer, you have to destroy at least half of your opponent's units that are either characters, monsters, or vehicles. If you do so, your entire army gains lethal hits on every attack. However, otherwise, you gain lethal hits against specifically characters, monsters, and vehicles, which, in fairness, are the keywords that you would probably most want to have lethal hits on regardless. So this is going to be just a dramatic improvement to your general damage output regardless. Now, in this list, we were including Arjak Rockfist. He's going to be attaching alongside potentially Logan Grimnar into one of the 2 units of Wolfguard Terminators in the army. So 2 Wolfguard Terminator units, both of these equipped entirely with Storm Shields, no special weapons in them besides a Relic Great Axe on the Terminator pack leader. And these guys are actually a pretty resilient bulwark. They're a Terminator profile, so a 2+ armor, 4+ invulnerable save, but they have a transhuman style of effect. So -1 to be wounded when your strength is higher than their toughness. So a lot of anti-heavy infantry sweepers actually get kind of fouled by this. A lot of them go to wound on 4s. You're then saving on 4s, and it takes 2 conversions, for example, a 3 damage weapon, to actually kill one of these Terminators. So compared to normal Terminator defensive lines, they're actually really, really tough. And then they're also acting as delivery systems for these powerful characters. Now, on top of that, their strength characteristic is not particularly high, because they're just a Strength 5 AP2 Power Sword profile. However, that lethal hits goes a long way to making them punch above their weight class. Now, we're also taking a Combi Lieutenant for some utility, Ragnar Blackmane, as well as a Wolf-touched Wolfguard Battle Leader. Now, what's interesting here is that the Wolf-touched enhancement allows the Battle Leader to attach into a Wolfen squad. However, it does not require that you do so. Otherwise, it just gives you +2 movement. So that Wolfguard Battle Leader can act as a slight threat range enhancement for whatever unit he's joining. Obviously, the movement buff won't apply to the rest of the unit. However, he can use it to sort of pull the rest of the unit along with him to get into melee. You can extend him out in front of the unit and then charge with them. And it still essentially increases the threat range of the unit by 2, although you will have to roll a relatively high charge distance to get the remainder of your infantry in. That's usually much easier because once you get in, you start to be able to use pile-in moves to get the unit to attack. So that 2 inches can go a long way. But just as an improvement for these infantry units, that does go pretty far. Now, on top of that, Ragnar Blackbane's also grant advance and charge, so we have 2 slight threat range amps to 2 units of Wolfguard Head Takers, both of them with paired Mastercrafted power weapons. Now, I love the paired power weapon profile. It gives you 6 2-damage power weapon attacks, which is in comparison to the 4+ invulnerable save profile that you can get on Head Takers if you take their Storm Shield instead, which just makes them kind of a weird knockoff version of a Blade Guard veteran. The paired weapon profile gives you a ton of attacks, and especially, again, once we're combining that with stratagems or lethal hits from the detachment, that can go a long way. Now, one of these Wolfguard Head Taker squads is actually taking 3 Hunting Wolves alongside it, which does make it relatively expensive. However, those Hunting Wolves give you an additional utility unit that is able to function normally with an OC bonus if they're nearby a Space Wolf character, of which we have several. Now we have an Intercessor squad to hold down the backline, another Fenrisian Wolf squad, which is a slightly enhanced version of the Hunting Wolves. They have a reactive move, in addition to being a separate datasheet. We have a Gladiator Reaper to help out the armies match up into infantry squads, alongside 2 Land Raiders. These are standard Land Raiders, by the way, Godhammer pattern Land Raiders with 2 side-mounted las cannons on each. And it's been a really long time since we've seen the classic Land Raider on the battlefield. However, in this detachment, again, when you're gaining lethal hits all the time, and you're using it to deliver these otherwise relatively tepid melee infantry, the big downside of this attachment, I should mention, is that you do not have access to any advanced charge or anything like that outside of Ragnar Blackbane. So that's why improving the threat range of these units is very important. So when we have something like a transport for them, so a Land Raider that can disembark these units, giving them the 3 inches of disembark plus 2 inches of movement for the Wolf-touched character, or advance and charge from Ragnar Blackbane, that will go a long way to shoring up the weaknesses of this detachment. But then the Land Raiders themselves, they do like getting those keywords on their weapons when they're firing at vehicles and stuff, and 2 Land Raiders together with their powers combined does bring a pretty significant amount of offensive power to the battlefield. Then we have a Scout Squad for utility, as well as a Thunderwolf Cavalry Squad. The Wolf-Guard Head Taker squads make total enormous numbers of attacks, between 16 and 36 from the unit themselves, and then an additional 7 to 10 from their attached character. You can gain lethal hits on those, rerolls from the attached Wolfguard Battle Leader, in addition to lethal and sustained hits, potentially based on the weapon that we're swinging with. So it's a lot of output. We can give +1 to wound to them from Unbridled Ferocity. And again, we're benefiting all of those ranged attacks from the Land Raiders and the Gladiator with those lethals as well. So the fact that it works on those weapons in the early game just gives that little bit of additional reliability to what is a limited number of anti-vehicle attacks, which can go quite a long way. But at the end of the day, it's really cool to see one of the bespoke detachments for Space Wolves seeing some play, given the fact that I think a lot of people just assumed that this faction would be playing in Gladius Task Force upon its release. And I think there's a lot of play within a Gladius Task Force build that looks a lot like this, where you're playing things like Wolfguard Headtakers that can get Honor of the Chapter, you're playing things like Wolfguard Terminators, and you're backing that up with powerful shooting. This does it with a specific Space Wolves flavor, however. Now, with that, we're going to move on to the Second City Games August GT and talk about some Adepta Sororitas. This event was won by Tyler White using a Hallowed Martyrs detachment. Now, this was a little different than we typically see in Hallowed Martyrs because this army is a little bit more aggressive than we typically see out of this detachment. It is running the Demonofuge. They're incredibly popular in this detachment for their combination of heroic intervention, fights first, and suffering and sacrifice. So you can do something like rapid ingress them and then heroically intervene them for free into a charging enemy, then force that enemy to attack the Demonofuge after the Demonofuge hits you. So you're going to eat 10 attacks between Ephriel Stern and Kaiganil. They're going to do a little bit of damage to you. You're going to be forced to attack into them, probably kill the unit because they're not that resilient. However, you can use Divine Intervention to then bring Ephriel Stern back and do it again the next turn. It's a classic combination. We have 2 Hospitallers who are going to be attached into 2 separate Celestian Sacrosanct squads to give the army a big brick of very resilient infantry who do appreciate getting damaged, but not necessarily being killed because they can respond some of that damage with the Hospitallers, but then also gain bonuses from the Hallowed Martyrs detachment ability. We also then have Morph and Fall and a unit of Paragon Warsuits, 2 Mortifiers to act as utility units. These guys are fairly competent combatants by themselves, but they also give up some Miracle Dice when they die, so you can run them out and do actions with them without being too upset that you lose them. Now, in order to combo with that, we also have a utility Canoness, but it's not the normal utility Canoness. Typically, what we'll see is 1 to 2 standard Canonesses, they're just the foot Canoness datasheet, who can give themselves a 2+ invulnerable save once per game in order to keep themselves alive and continue to perform actions. In this case, however, we're taking a Jump Pack Canoness, who does hit a little bit harder and is much faster, allowing her to do a lot more interesting utility stuff on turn 1 over a foot variety. Now, she has Saintly Example, so she's going to run in, perform an action, take an objective, maybe kill a utility unit or something, then be killed, generate a bunch of Miracle Dice through Saintly Example, and then you can use Divine Intervention to bring her back to life and do it again the next turn. It's not quite as consistent as it is with the standard Canoness, although given the fact that she cannot use a 2+ invulnerable save, she might actually generate those Miracle Dice more consistently because your opponent is not disincentivized to attack her. We then have a pair of Immolators with twin multi-meltas, and those are going to embark and split a pair of Dominion squads. And that's what gives this army a little bit more aggression than we typically see. Now, the Dominion squads can split into a combat squad of bolter-equipped sisters as well as a quartet of usually melta-guns in the second half. The Dominions themselves have a reactive move, so they're able to jump in and out of the Immolators and are very difficult to pin down, making them excellent utility units, and they give the Immolators a 6-inch scout, so on turn 1, you are also able to play very aggressive, and you can start to clear enemies that deploy very aggressively on turn 1, or simply movement block them with the caveat that you could at any time potentially jump back into the transport with that reactive move in response to enemy charging. So this army is keyed fairly well between those, the faster jump pack Canoness than we typically see for the utility Canonesses, as well as a bunch of utility from the Mortifiers. It's keyed very well to go first. It's going to be scouting, it's going to be moving high movement utility units up into the middle of the table, and it could potentially force you to deploy respecting its ability to come out and touch you, which I think is really interesting. I've been pointing out quite a bit that players are more and more building their armies to go first because going second is so strong in Chapter Approved 2025 that you don't really need that much help in order to win going second. Basically, the advantage bar is already skewed in your favor if you're going second, so if you have a bunch of abilities that help you out going first, that can actually shore up your win rate to give you a little bit of an edge in those matchups as well. And we are sort of seeing that being used here. Now with that, we're going to move over to Trondheim Dome 3 to talk about the 2 ties for first place here. Now in first place, thanks to tiebreakers, was Are Belsas running Tau Empire. Now, Are was running a Kauyon detachment, so this is the late game focused detachment. It gives you bonuses on Battle Round 3 onwards. Gives you, at this point, gives you sustained hits as well as ignore modifiers on your attacks, which is very nice. We have Commander Shadow Sun, so just a single character in the army, no enhancements to speak of, but she gives a passive reroll hits aura, so she can benefit a large brick of vehicles, which is basically what we're going to be seeing here. Now, the other thing, too, is that pulls a lot of the emphasis off of things like stealth battlesuit teams, since you don't necessarily need to be getting the stealth battlesuits to spot for enemies to gain hit rerolls, which is a nice little piece of flexibility. Obviously, she doesn't grant the wound rerolls that stealth battlesuit teams do, but it does allow you to spot with other things like your devilfish, for example, or your pathfinders without feeling too bad about losing those hit rolls. Now, we have a breacher team in the battle line. These guys go pretty crazy in this detachment. Oftentimes in the past, we would see them built in with fire blades as well as Exemplar of the Kauyon in order to activate the detachment ability earlier in the game. However, since the detachment ability was nerfed slightly from getting access to sustained hits too, those breachers are not quite as effective. However, these guys as a trading unit are incredibly powerful because they are getting their wound rolls and targeting an enemy on an objective. And since they already hit on twos when guided and probably get rerolls either from Shadow Sun or from the stealth battlesuits, they convert more than 100% of their incoming attacks thanks to the detachment ability once it's active. So even without any buffs, they're still going to be putting a kind of insane amount of damage downtown at a relatively inexpensive points value. Now we have a bunch of additional utility infantry, one Pathfinder team for some forward operation, Crew Carnivores for OBSEC and Scout, as well as a unit of Vespid Stingwings to up, down, and score secondaries in your opponent's deployment zone. Now, interestingly, there is a unit of 2 Crutox Riders. For a relatively inexpensive points value, these guys do bring kind of a very impressive defensive stat line. They have a solid melee and ranged profile, especially into other utility units. They're only 60 points, and they come in at 10 toughness 6 wounds, which is kind of tough to chew through for a lot of utility stuff. If you're taking your assault intercessors or something and expecting to jump in and clear out your opponent's, 70 to 90 point infantry units, once you hit the bulwark of a Crutox Rider squad, you might just not kill it without a bunch of buffs being layered on top, which makes the Crutox Riders really interesting. They also still scout just like all the other Crut units, so they can still act as a forward operator, and they can still perform secondaries on turn 1, hold down objectives, and again, be another unit that's pretty good on turn 1 just to run up the middle and score some secondaries if you draw them. Now, on top of that, we also have some additional infiltration from a Ghost Kill Battlesuit, 2 individual Piranhas for more scouting, a Devilfish to carry the Breacher team around, and a ton of backline shooting. A Railgun-equipped Hammerhead gunship to hope for that 1 in a million shot where you hit the 6 on the sustained hit, get 2 Railgun shots through, and 1 shot of Land Raider or something, which everyone's really excited about when it happens. We have 3 Riptide Battlesuits, those guys equipped with ion accelerators, as well as 2 Skyray gunships, and that's where all the damage from the army is going. Once you are active in Battle Round 3, you can play kind of passively early in the game. You can use those Crutox Riders, use those Crew Carnivores, use those Pathfinders to try to keep yourself live on score. Then once you get to the mid-game and your detachment ability pops off, you expose all of the Hammerheads and the Skyray gunships, and you just sort of lay waste to your opponent with, especially the multi-damage shots from the Skyrays and the Hammerheads get a huge benefit from sustained hits, because each one of those hits that does sustain is a huge amount of expected damage that duplicates itself. Now moving on from there, we can talk about the second place placer at the Tronder Dome 3. This is Nick Brooks running Drukhari in a Reaper's Wager. Now, again, this is going to be a relatively aggressively oriented army with a lot of fast units and scouting units that can punish your opponent if you go first. This includes an Archon with Arch Raider to give his transport a 9-inch scout move, so you're able to get that guy and his venom right up in your opponent's face really early. If they have any utility stuff, he can potentially hop out and just kill them turn 1 with his full rerolls from pain tokens, or you can set him up to OBSEC objectives in the future. You also have 2 Beastmasters, so with some additional long-distance scouting. Lelith Hesperax to hop into a unit of Witches, getting combat squatted by Venom, plus Urian Rakarth as one of the game's most solid utility units. We have 2 units of Kabalite Warriors, so one of them gets attached to the Archon. Another one can hop into the 3rd Venom, so we're going to have 2 combat squatted units of Kabalites plus a combat squatted unit of Witches to act as utility and run around the back of the battlefield. We have a Chronos to regenerate pain tokens, which is important because this detachment can run out of pain tokens very quickly. A big unit of 10 Hellions for some infantry-based, for some fairly solid counterpunch, as well as 2 units of Mandrakes for utility and a bunch of Scourges for shooting. We do have a Ravager equipped with Dark Lances to act as a relatively efficient trading piece, but then a bunch of Scourges to do the real heavy lifting. That includes 1 Dark Lance unit of Scourges, so these are 5 models each. There's no additional Scourges besides the Solarite in each unit. So there's 1 with 4 Dark Lances to act as a good anti-tank into a variety of targets, and then 2 units of 4 Drukhari Haywire Blasters for the anti-vehicle devastating wounds, which can do tons and tons of damage to things like Knights, Space Marines, other vehicle factions. However, a little bit inconsistent into some other armies where they don't get their anti-vehicle. So Always a bit of a gamble going as heavy into Haywire as this particular army has. However, obviously in this case, it clearly worked out since Nick did go undefeated. To layer on top of that, we also have a Skyweaver unit rocking Haywire cannons alongside. Now, the nice thing about the Harlequin inclusions in these Reaper's Wager armies is that the Harlequin units begin the game losing the wager, and thanks to the recent updates to the detachment, they always gain their reroll once they hit. Previously, they would have to be losing the wager in order to gain reroll once they hit. Now the whole army does that. So at a baseline, everything's rerolling ones all the time, which is very nice. The Skyweavers don't have to necessarily be losing to do that. However, when you start off, they will gain wound rerolls of 1, which is hugely beneficial for, again, anti-vehicle devastating Haywire cannons that they are rocking on their platforms. So we have the potential that we can get wound rerolls to trigger additional Haywire cannon damage to then flip Harlequins into winning the wager, which then gives Drukhari rerolls on their shooting. So if you can sequence the attacks the correct manner, you can potentially get the Skyweavers to get rerolls themselves, then flip the wager to giving rerolls to everybody else in both the shooting and potentially the fight phases if you sequence it correctly, which is a lot of additional value for that one inclusion of a single unit. And oftentimes we are seeing just one unit of Harlequins being taken in this detachment to benefit from that second half of the ability. Obviously, it's a little bit pie in the sky to get the perfect activation where you shoot the Skyweavers early, you benefit from the wound rerolls on them, flip the wager over to Drukhari, Drukhari start losing, they gain the wound rerolls, flip it back to Harlequins for the fight phase, Skyweavers charge, kill something in melee, flip it back to themselves for some Drukhari units for later on in the fight phase. That is potentially possible, but it is very pie in the sky. But at the worst case scenario, even if the Skyweavers don't necessarily total anything themselves, the baseline of the detachment is that you're getting hit rerolls of 1, and the Skyweavers just basically then have a baked-in benefit of wound rerolls of 1 most of the time, which is hugely beneficial for the types of profiles that they are bringing to the table. Now, with that, we are moving over to the Hyper 364 GT, which was won by Vyacheslav Marenkov with an Aeldari Aspect Host. Now, we've been talking a lot about war hosts recently in Aeldari, the more maneuver-focused attachment, and Aspect Host has kind of fallen by the wayside, but it's never really disappeared, and it is kind of cool to talk about this, and especially a list like this at this stage of Eldar development. Now, in this army, we were focusing extremely heavily on Epic Heroes and Phoenix Lords. No less than 4 Phoenix Lords in the army: Asurman, Fuegan, Janezar, and Lycus. So those are the Phoenix Lords for the Dire Avengers, Fire Dragons, Howling Banshees, and Warp Spiders, respectively, as well as including Eldrad Ulthran in the list for command point generation. Now, I don't believe that we have any attachments for Eldrad, so he's just going to be hanging out by himself. If you are not expecting to see any indirect fire from your opponent, Eldrad is just fine vibing and generating you command points. Now, if you are expected to see indirect fire, you can hide him in a Wave Serpent for the majority of the game, and then hop him out to benefit your army with +1 to wound. You can also potentially use Skyborn Sanctuary in the detachment to hide him back in the transport at the end of the turn in order to keep him alive and continuously use his +1 to wound ability in matchups where you need the bonus damage into high value targets. Now, we're also taking a Death Jester in the army as well. This guy's another nice little inclusion if you have any free space inside of a Falcon, which I believe that we typically will, because the Falcons have a transport capacity of 6, and we do have a unit of 5 Fire Dragons who are probably being carried around by a Falcon. However, the Death Jester being able to hop out, use his sustained hits 3, and then benefit from the Falcon's fire support rerolls can be very nice. Worst case scenario, he's also just a relatively speedy lone operative character. So he's able to hold down objectives, wander around, and give you secondary play without being in grave danger. This also means that if you are putting Eldrad into your vehicles to keep him safe, and you're trying to keep as many of your units off the table as possible to protect it from indirect fire and artillery, this guy is totally immune. So he can just stand out in the open, and it doesn't matter if your opponent has lots of indirect to shoot at him. Now, from there, we have Asurman with a unit of Dire Avengers. These guys are pretty impactful inside Aspect Host, inside a Falcon, because they can gain hit rerolls, they can gain wound rerolls from the Falcon, and with Asurman's move and shoot and scoot ability to move after shooting, they can re-embark the Falcon at the end of their shooting. Then you can have a separate unit in another transport use Skyborn Sanctuary to keep themselves alive. Asurman also can use his once per game Devastating Wounds to do some absolutely incredible damage. Plus, the Dire Avengers just become a bit of an infantry slaughterhouse in the late game after Asurman's popped all of his abilities. And we also then have Fuegan with the unit of 10 10 fire dragons, which can hop into the Wave Serpent to protect them and move them up the battlefield. He gives them the additional range so they can do some crazy stuff. We have Jane Czar with a unit of Howling Banshees for a little bit of melee disruption because she is so fast with an auto 6 advance and advance in charge thanks to the Howling Banshees. She can hop between objectives and knock enemies off of their objectives in order to keep them off balance on primary. Then we have Lycus with a unit of Warp Spiders, basically the same deal, but we can also trigger 5-up critical hits for things like sustained hits off of any of the units that have it naturally, or there is a stratagem inside Aspect Host to gain sustained hits on your Aspect Warrior teams. Potentially even sustained and lethal hits if you spend an Aspect Shrine token when using Preternatural Precision. Plus, we have a Warlock Skyrunner for some mounted utility, alongside a unit of Striking Scorpions for a little bit of forward operation and early game disruption. Interestingly, we have a unit of 3 Shining Spears, which is not a unit that we see very often. However, they do get pretty reliable inside Aspect Host, since they get hit and wound rerolls of 1. And given the fact that Shining Spears are almost entirely just hitting and wounding basically the whole game on 3s, they unfortunately do get a little inconsistent inside other detachments. However, Aspect Host can shore up that to some extent. These guys are good at finishing off vehicles that you've already damaged with your tanks shooting, or with, for example, a unit of 5 fire dragons. If they haven't entirely killed a heavy target, the Shining Spears can come in and do the last couple of points of damage to them. The Shining Spears are also good at messing with other infantry units. They do have strength 5 lance attacks, so if their multi-damage is relevant, they can knock down sort of medium to heavy infantry in small numbers as well. So not too bad of a disruption piece, especially given their mobility. Plus, then we have a War Walker in addition to the transports. So 2 Falcons, 1 for the Dire Avengers, 1 for, I believe, the 5 Fire Dragons. While the Fire Dragons don't typically need wound rerolls from the Falcon because they gain full hit and wound rerolls against monsters and vehicles anyway, that's going to give them the ability with fire support to get wound rerolls targeting everything, so they could work just as well against heavy infantry, for example. They gain reroll once they hit, they have potentially auto hits from their Aspect Shrine token, and then wound rerolls into what is probably a minimum 4 damage gun, thanks to their Melta ability. And then we have a Wave Serpent for the larger unit of Fire Dragons, plus a Warwalker to buff any of that shooting that's going into heavier armored targets. Now with that, we are going to hop into our last, but certainly not least army, because I am excited to talk about Grey Knights and their new codex. Now, I will mention as well, the Eternal Wrath GT did not use the updated rules, so this was in the context of full power Imperial Knights and Death Guard. However, that does mean that it's more impressive that Grey Knights took this one down, although it was a relatively smaller event, and Jordan Penning here went 4-0-1, so ended up with a natural draw on his record, but still won the event. Now, in this case, we are playing a Brotherhood Strike Detachment. This gives you reroll hits and wounds of 1 each time you arrive using Deep Strike. And given that you can use Gate of Infinity to reposition yourself around the battlefield, then set up using Deep Strike, you can constantly be generating this ability. So it gives you a little bit of a different variety of something like a Warpbane Task Force, where you're gaining hit rerolls when you're nearby your purifiers or in your area of hallowed ground. However, it also gives you the wound rerolls for some additional consistency, with the extra rider that you have to constantly be Gate of Infinitying around the table. Now, with that, we are rocking Castellan Crow in a unit of 10 purifiers with 4 Psy Cannons, able to bring kind of a withering amount of firepower to the battlefield, since each one of them is going to be getting 2 shots from their Purifying Flame psychic power, plus 4 shots with the Stormbolter, and the units equipped with 4 Psy Cannons. Purifiers will also gain full wound rerolls when targeting enemies on objectives, and you could use Combat Manifestation to bring these guys in 6 inches away from enemies. So if you can find a situation where you can get them around cover, you can actually get some crazy shots with this huge battery of shooting that can clear out 2 or 3 lighter enemy units all in one go, which can be a devastating amount of damage to an army that needs to screen very heavily to protect itself against things like Nemesis Dread Knights. Now, we're also bringing a Brotherhood champion with Tome of Forbidden Ways that allows you to bring additional units up into Strategic Reserve using Gate of Infinity, allowing more of the army to benefit from the detachment ability each turn. Now, the Brotherhood Librarian is going to be hopping into a unit of 5 Paladins. Now, I have to imagine that some of the benefit here is that Brotherhood Librarian does give you an 18-inch lone operative effect, so he can protect his brothers from shooting, which can help you if they are in Strategic Reserve, wrap rapid ingress into better positions, because if you can rapid ingress into an aggressive spot, but ensure that even if your opponent's army has line of sight to you, most of it can't attack you since you're going to be out of range, that then lets you get a more advantageous charge on the subsequent turn. Now, the little bit of anti-synergy that Brotherhood Strike has here, and this is unfortunately kind of present around the Grey Knight's Codex, is that if you use rapid ingress to arrive, the detachment ability will expire before it comes back to your turn. So you will not get the hit and wound rerolls of 1, which obviously Paladins would love to do since they go to 3 damage once they're stuck in melee. Plus, the unit hits pretty hard in melee with both ranged and melee attacks as well. The Brotherhood Librarian's able to shoot a pretty impressive Vortex of Doom effect, plus you're also getting 3 Psy Cannons inside a Paladin squad. Now, that said, once you're stuck in any of these units that do get into engagement range of an enemy and the enemy falls back, you can use Duty Unending to just pull those units back into reserve and then do the same thing again the next turn. So hopefully you are able to ingress into those good spots and then engage enemy units because you can force them into that annoying pattern. Now, from there, we also have 3 strike squads. So this army has an incredible amount of utility. There's also a Calidus Assassin, which can pull itself up into reserve, obviously. It can mess with opponents' command point generation, and it's also another utility unit alongside those three strike squads. So we do have a certain amount of forward operations since we're actually able to use the strike squads to scout up into the center. We can also potentially use them just to try to roll 9-inch charges out of Deep Strike to make use of their powerful melee profile, plus the reroll once they hit and wound with melee attacks. So with 3 of these guys, we can obsec a bunch of objectives, then pop off the objectives, and then try to bang 9-inch charges to put 10 OC onto enemy objectives. And with 3 of them a turn, the chances you make 1 or 2 of those is actually fairly high, especially with a command point reroll. So it is making the best use of the detachment ability it can, in addition to just scoring well. And then, obviously, the majority of sustained damage from the army is coming from all the Nemesis Dread Knights. So while we are using things like Purifiers and Paladins to kind of shore up and hammer blow down particular enemies, the army is including 2 Nemesis Dread Knights as well as 2 Nemesis Grandmasters. The Grandmasters are equipped with Sublimators, the new ranged weapon, alongside Nemesis Demon Hammers, but those Sublimators give them pretty solid anti-tank shooting thanks to its twin-linked. So generally speaking, a lot of this army is going to be focused on those Nemesis Dread Knights, popping the Nemesis Dread Knights up and down to grant them all of those massive numbers of rerolls. But then when your opponent comes in close, or when you are able to get a clutch rapid ingress off, you can counterattack them with Paladins or Purifiers in order to total those aggressive enemies. And with that, those are all the best armies of Warhammer 40k for this week. Thanks so much for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to Frontline Gaming and the Las Vegas Open for sponsoring this video. Let me know down in the comment section what you think about the slide format I used here. I'm going to try to do it more often if I can. But with that, thanks to everybody who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are amazing, and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.